Imagine standing in the heart of an ancient northern forest. Around you, the trees rise like towering giants, their snow-laden branches casting long, skeletal shadows across the pristine white ground. The temperature is dropping rapidly, plunging far below freezing. Every breath you take feels like inhaling shards of glass. The wind begins to howl, a mournful sigh that vibrates through the very marrow of your bones. You look back, but the trail you walked is already buried, wiped clean by the swirling white vortex. You are entirely alone, or, at least, that is what you try to tell yourself. But deep down in that primal, instinctual corner of your mind, you know you are being watched. There is a presence moving through the pines, light as a falling feather, yet heavy with ancient weight. Your heart beats faster. A branch snaps behind you, but when you spin around, there is nothing there. Only the endless, suffocating white silence. This is the realm of the great winter chill. It is a place where the line between survival and despair becomes paper-thin. In these vast, frozen expanses of North American woods, the winter is not just a season. It is a living, breathing force. It is an environment that tests the absolute limits of human endurance, pushing the mind to places of deep, quiet vulnerability. For centuries, those who traveled these silent woods whispered of something else out there. Something born of the cold, born of the hunger, and nurtured by the dark. It is a concept so profound, so deeply rooted in the history of the land, that it transcends mere bedtime stories. It is an ancient mystery that has haunted human thoughts for generations, waiting in the shadows. To truly understand this ancient mystery, we must travel back through the centuries to the traditional territories of the Algonquian-speaking peoples. These nations, including the Ojibwe, the Cree, the Soto, the Naskapi, and the Innu, inhabited the vast, rugged landscapes stretching from the Great Lakes region up into the deep subarctic forests of Canada and the northeastern United States. In these communities, stories were vital repositories of wisdom, history, and social law. And among these narratives, none carried a more terrifying weight than the legend of the winter spirit. The name of this entity varies across dialects, sometimes pronounced Wendigo, Windigo, or Wetiko, but its essence remains chillingly consistent. Linguistic experts suggest the name may trace its ancestry back to an ancient word for the owl, a nocturnal predator of the deep woods associated with silence and the dark. But in the minds of the people, it was the absolute embodiment of winter, starvation, and spiritual corruption. To the elders, this entity was not just a physical predator lurking behind the snowbanks. It was a cosmic warning. It represented what happens when spiritual balance is lost, and when the cooperative bonds of a community fracture under the pressure of extreme hardship. In the deep winter, when food supplies dwindled to nothing, families were isolated in their lodges for months. The fear of starvation was an ever-present, suffocating shadow. The folklore of this entity served as a psychological shield, a way to externalize that terrifying desperation and establish a firm, unyielding boundary around what it means to remain human. To give in to the darkness was to lose one's humanity entirely, transforming into the very monster one feared. When we look at modern depictions of this legendary creature, we often see a beast with towering antlers and the skull of a deer. But if we return to the authentic oral traditions of the Algonquian peoples, we find a completely different and arguably far more unsettling portrait. The traditional entity bears no horns, no hooves, and no stag-like features. Instead, it is described as a giant, gaunt humanoid, emaciated to the absolute extreme. According to legendary accounts, its skin is desiccated, pulled so tautly over its skeletal frame that its bones seem to push outward against the gray, ash-colored flesh. Its eyes are sunken deep within their sockets, burning with a cold, unnatural luminescence. It lacks lips, its mouth tattered and worn away, revealing jagged teeth. A putrid, overwhelming aroma of decay and decomposition clings to it, preceding its arrival like a toxic fog. It is the literal physical manifestation of a body ravaged by extreme frostbite and starvation. But the most terrifying aspect of its physiology is its heart, which is made entirely of solid ice. This frozen core represents a total absence of warmth, empathy, and human connection. And its hunger is governed by a cruel, paradoxical curse. Whenever the creature consumes its forbidden nourishment, it instantly grows in physical size in direct proportion to the meal it has just partaken. Because its body expands with every feast, its stomach is never filled. It remains perpetually starving, eternally desperate, and driven to hunt continuously without ever finding peace. It is a tragic loop of infinite consumption and infinite lack, a perfect metaphor for greed that knows no boundaries. The transition into this monstrous entity, a process referred to in oral histories as going Wendigo, is not a simple physical metamorphosis. It is, first and foremost, a spiritual and psychological corruption. In Algonquian cosmology, the entity is understood as a malevolent spirit seeking a vulnerable host to possess. A person might succumb to this possession through several paths. The most common is violating the ultimate taboo. During brutal winter famines, when camps were entirely cut off from game, individuals sometimes faced an unimaginable choice to survive. Some chose to consume the physical remains of those who had already perished. But the lore warns that this act came with a devastating spiritual price. The moment a person partook in the forbidden feast of their own kind, they opened a door within their soul. The cold spirit of the forest would enter, claiming the individual and sealing their transformation. Yet, physical consumption was not the only way to invite the spirit in. Susceptibility was also deeply tied to character. Those who exhibited extreme selfishness, gluttony, or a desire to hoard resources while their companions starved were viewed as highly vulnerable. The legend thus functioned as a powerful, practical tool for social cohesion. In the unforgiving northern wilderness, sharing was not just a moral virtue, it was the baseline for survival. By stigmatizing greed with the threat of becoming a ravenous monster, the community reinforced the necessity of mutual support. Additionally, a powerful shaman could direct the spirit to curse an individual, or the entity could invade a victim's mind through terrifying dreams, gradually warping their thoughts until they lost all self-control. To protect themselves from this looming spiritual threat, and to heal those whose minds were beginning to drift toward the dark, the Algonquian peoples developed sophisticated ritual practices. Among the Ojibwe, Cree, and the Assiniboine, a highly structured ceremonial dance was staged during times of severe environmental stress. This ritual, known as the Windigokan, was a satirical and profound performance designed to reinforce social taboos and dispel the creeping fear of winter starvation. The facilitators of these rituals belonged to a highly respected, sacred society of ceremonial clowns known as the Windigokan. To join this society, an individual had to experience a powerful visionary encounter, often involving the thunder spirit or a supernatural dream of a skeleton known as Paguk. This visionary foundation granted them the authority to act as spiritual doctors and protectors of the community. The most striking feature of the Windigokan was their commitment to contrary behavior. During ceremonies, they wore elaborate masks with long, drooping noses and clothed themselves in tattered rags. They moved through the village dancing entirely backward and practiced reverse speech, saying the exact opposite of what they actually meant. If they wanted to say yes, they would say no. If they wished to tell someone to go away, they would beckon them close. While their actions appeared absurd and chaotic, their purpose was deeply serious. Just as the winter monster represented the ultimate inversion of natural human behavior and social kinship, the Windigokan utilized inverted, contrary actions to cure illness, banish evil influences, and restore psychological balance to a stressed community. By bringing the terror of the wilderness into the light through theater, humor, and absurdity, the community collectively processed their trauma, reminding themselves that even in the deepest freeze, their bonds of kinship could not be broken. As Western explorers, fur traders, and academic researchers ventured deeper into the northern forests, they struggled to comprehend the spiritual cosmology of the indigenous peoples. In cataloging these beliefs, Western medicine translated the legend of the winter spirit into a clinical psychiatric diagnosis known as Wendigo psychosis, widely accepted by the mid-20th century as a culture-bound syndrome. Clinically, the disorder was described as starting with deep apathy, depression, and anxiety brought on by winter isolation. The individual would then develop a terrifying delusion. They believed they were actively transforming into the winter beast, accompanied by an intense craving to consume their companions. Early psychiatry cited several cases as proof, most notably that of a Cree trapper named Swift Runner in the winter of 1878. Stranded in the frozen wilderness with his family, Swift Runner reportedly took the lives of his wife and children, consuming their remains to sustain his own. At his trial, he did not deny his actions, but claimed a malevolent spirit had possessed him, compelling him to commit these dark deeds against his will. He ultimately met his final punishment under colonial law. For decades, this and other accounts were taken at face value. However, in the early 1980s, anthropologist Lou Marano published a groundbreaking critique, arguing that Wendigo psychosis, as an objective mental illness, likely never existed. Marano suggested that Western researchers had committed a fundamental error, failing to distinguish between the emic, the internal cultural beliefs of a people, and the etic, the objective behaviors observed under environmental duress. Marano, archival research revealed no reliable evidence of spontaneous, psychotic craving for forbidden nourishment that was not simply the result of extreme, life-threatening starvation. Instead, he proposed that the removal of accused individuals was actually a form of triage. In isolated winter camps facing famine, an individual who became a burden, showed violent instability, or stopped contributing to survival, became a threat to the group. Accusing them of possession provided a socially acceptable way to remove them, a desperate survival mechanism that early anthropologists misclassified as clinical madness. While anthropologists and psychiatrists debated the psychosis, indigenous scholars and philosophers began to look at the legend through a wider lens. They realized that the core architecture of the winter spirit, an entity driven by insatiable greed that destroys its environment, perfectly described a massive, systemic pathology infecting modern global society. In 1978, the Native American historian and philosopher Jack D. Forbes published Columbus and Other Cannibals. Forbes used the Cree term Wetiko to describe a psychological and cultural disease that has ravaged human history. In his view, a Wetiko is anyone who consumes another's life for their own private purpose, power, or profit. The literal consumption of human flesh is replaced by systemic exploitation, slavery, colonialism, and the ecological destruction of the earth. Forbes argued that when European colonizers arrived, indigenous peoples recognized them as being chronically infected with this spiritual sickness. They saw a culture that was never satisfied, continually seeking to acquire more land, wealth, and resources, destroying ancient ecosystems and felling entire civilizations. This concept has been expanded by contemporary thinkers like Paul Levy, who describes Wetiko as a form of mass hypnosis and a disease of dissociation. In this framework, the sickness of greed operates like a mind virus, spreading silently through institutions and corporations. It compels individuals to project their own internal darkness onto others, justifying conflict, exploitation, and unchecked consumption. The warning of the traditional winter spirit has thus scaled perfectly from a survival guide for a small family camp to a diagnostic tool for global industrial civilization, warning that any system built on endless, unsustainable consumption will eventually consume itself. But how did this terrifying formless spirit of winter starvation become the antlered, deer-headed monster of popular culture. This visual evolution reveals a fascinating trajectory of cultural adaptation and media distortion. The shift began in 1910 with Algernon Blackwood's influential novella, The Wendigo. Blackwood reframed the spirit as an elemental forest demon, focusing on the atmospheric terror of the untamed wilderness. Although he did not explicitly give the creature antlers, his framing laid the groundwork for Western audiences to associate the entity with European forest folklore. The definitive visual transformation occurred in 2001 with Larry Fessenden's horror film Wendigo. Fessenden admitted in interviews that as a child, he had conflated the traditional indigenous legend with unrelated European stories of horned forest spirits and deer monsters. His film combined these concepts, creating a visual design featuring a humanoid with stag-like antlers. This striking visual shorthand was quickly absorbed by tabletop role, playing games like Pathfinder and Dungeons & Dragons, which depicted the creature as a spectral skeletal deer monster. Over time, this design became so dominant that many today assume antlers are part of the original mythology. Cultural critics and indigenous scholars argue that this visual alteration is a form of cultural appropriation and whitewashing. By adding antlers, frequently used in Western culture as symbols of nature and spirituality, creators romanticize the creature, turning a grim warning about starvation and survival into a generic, mystical forest monster. This visual sanitization allows media companies to exploit indigenous folklore while avoiding confrontation with the realities of colonial history and the systematic disruption of native food supplies. Furthermore, modern media often conflates the winter spirit with the Wetiko, an entirely separate cannibalistic entity from Athabascan folklore of the Northwest Pacific coast that actually does feature animalistic spirit guide elements. When we look at modern media, we see two distinct paths. On one hand, projects like the 1999 film Ravenous capture the underlying themes of the myth, using consumption as a dark metaphor for greed and expansionism. On the other hand, interactive games like Until Dawn receive praise for rejecting the antlered aesthetic. Instead, Until Dawn depicts the creatures accurately as pale, hairless, hyper-agile, emaciated humanoids, whose transformation is driven strictly by partaking in forbidden survival feasts. In the end, the legend of the winter spirit is far more than a scary story to be told around a campfire. It is a mirror held up to humanity, reflecting our deepest fears and our greatest weaknesses. In its original subarctic home, it was a vital social tool, a psychological safeguard designed to keep a community united, cooperative, and compassionate during times of unimaginable cold and desperation. It warned that to turn inward, to prioritize one's own desires above the survival of the group, was to invite a slow, irreversible corruption of the soul. When Western society medicalized it, they stripped away its ecological context, transforming a painful communal survival struggle into an isolated mental illness. And when popular culture aestheticized it, they gave it antlers and turned it into a generic beast of the woods, distancing us even further from its profound, unsettling truth. But as the indigenous philosophers of the 20th century reminded us, the true monster is not a creature hiding in the snowy forests of Canada. The true monster is the spirit of unchecked acquisition, of taking without giving back, of exploiting others and consuming the very earth that sustains us. Perhaps the cold wind howling through the northern pines is not a warning of an external predator. Perhaps it is a warning of what we might become if we forget our shared humanity, lose our balance, and let the ice take over our hearts.